Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Richard Kreitner's new book, Break It Up, Secession, Division, and the Secret History of America's Imperfect Union, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 19 Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Richard and Rick, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. Tonight, we are beyond excited to have with us journalist and historian Richard Kreitner to launch his new book, Break It Up. Born in Queens, Richard grew up in Wayne, New Jersey, and studied philosophy at McGill University in Montreal. Since 2012, he has been affiliated with The Nation as an intern, editor, and writer. He has also published essays, reviews, and articles in Slate, Raritan, The Baffler, The Boston Globe, The New York Review of Books, and The New York Times. His books are Break It Up, Secession, Division, and the Secret History of America's Imperfect Union, and Book, A Traveler's Guide to Literary Locations Around the World. He also writes Only United in Name, an occasional newsletter about politics and history. Joining Richard in conversation is Richard Perlstein. Rick is the author of Reagan Land, America's Right Turn, 1976 through 1980. Before that, he published The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, Nixon Land, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America, a New York Times bestseller picked as one of the best nonfiction books of the year by over a dozen publications, and Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, winner of the 2001 Los Angeles Times Book Award for History. Former chief national correspondent for The Village Voice and a former online columnist for The New Republic and Rolling Stone. His journalism and essays have appeared in Newsweek, The New York Times, and many other publications. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard and Rick to the stage.
Here we go.
Hi.
Hi, Sabir.
Hi. So
Hi.
you have a job to do right now.
Yes.
We've decided, since we are equal in all things, Richard and Ricky, Ricky and Richard, Eric and Richard, that we are going to flip a coin to decide who asks the first question of the other, and we've asked Sabir to do the honors. I think Ricky, you should call it. And
Okay.
you get to choose who goes first, and if I win, I get to choose who goes first.
Alrighty.
All right.
Tails.
It's heads. Rick.
I will go second.
In asking a question.
Yes, you're going to ask me the question first.
Okay, got it.
Straight off, I think.
All right. Well, I've got my questions here. You know, I think what most people remember about Reagan's presidential campaign of 1980, which is the culmination of Reagan Land, your new book, is the speech that he gave kicking off the general election campaign at the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 16 years earlier, the bodies of civil rights workers had been discovered, and they'd been murdered by the Klan in cahoots with the local police. And people accused Reagan of racism, justly, for doing that. And you show in the book that Reagan was really uncomfortable with that, and visibly so, and kind of muddled his remarks, and they ended up causing a big backlash and didn't help him at all, even in Mississippi among white voters. So my question for you is, my whole book's about secession and states' rights. To what extent did Reagan himself believe in, a states' rights theory of the Constitution, or was he, as on that occasion, only using it instrumentally, to serve a purpose?
Thank you, Richard. One of the things that excites me so much about your book, in fact, so much so that I almost felt like you'd written the book that I dreamed of writing maybe 10 or 20 years from now, is that you place absolutely at the center of the narrative the fact that the idea that the United States are united is a myth. And then I realized, having read the whole book very closely and with great delight, that in fact you didn't write the book that I want to write. You wrote a great foundation for the book I want to write, which is after you've demonstrated all the ways that America has been profoundly disunited, and I think you also kind of imply always will be profoundly disunited. The project I've always wanted to take on, and which is kind of exists in fragments for all the books that I've written, the 4 books that I've written, is why Americans, and especially American elites, have so frantically and insistently wanted to believe that America is united, to the extent that they deny all the structural conflict in American life. So that gets into the answer to the question you ask. So this is one of the most famous things that happened in the 1980 campaign, and one of the reasons it's so indelibly remembered is it was one of the only things that the Carter campaign did during that election that was truly effective and competent. So the background is really quite striking and ironic. One of the main parts of Reagan's political strategy was derived from a pollster of his who basically came up with the guidebook, the 167 guidebook for the campaign. And one of his principles was people think that Ronald Reagan is a bigot. They fear that Ronald Reagan's a bigot, but they might have sympathy with his ideas. They might even harbor a little bigotry themselves. So the most important thing they had to do about that was to convince all voters that, in fact, supporting Ronald Reagan was not an act of bigotry. And the way they realized that they could do that was a template that all Republican campaigns have repeated since, and in which, in fact, the Trump campaign repeated in spades last week at their convention, which is to speak as often as possible before African-American audiences, and to have as many African-Americans as possible speak on his behalf. And that this was not an attempt at outreach for Black voters, but it was an outreach towards what we now call kind of suburban moderates. And so that was why, when they decided where they were going to open their general election campaign, they decided to do it before the Urban League, the big African-American mainstream civil rights organization. In fact, probably the most moderate of all the civil rights organization. But there was a scheduling snafu. So the part that was supposed to be the second speech ended up being the first speech. The idea for speaking at a county fair in Mississippi was to send a signal to the Carter campaign that they could not take the president's home region for granted, and that the South was going to be in play really for the first time since the Civil War, as you understand as well as anyone. And he was just going to give his standard speech, but he got picked up at the airport by his Mississippi campaign chairman, a young congressman named Trent Lott. Trent Lott had been the president of the fraternity at Ole Miss that served as the arsenal for the rioters who kept James Meredith from matriculating on campus in 1962. Mm-hmm. And what Trent Lott told him was if he really wanted the crowd eating out of his hand, he would say that he was a supporter of states' rights, which, of course, was the code word phrase that every racist would bellow at the top of their lungs at a place like the Neshoba County Fair in order to signal their sympathy for white supremacy. And Ronald Reagan did this. But as I argue, if you actually listen to the speech, his energy just kind of drains and drains and drains the closer he comes to the formulation. It's one of the worst Ronald Reagan speeches I've ever heard. He keeps on telling 3 times more jokes than he does usual, 3 times more charming stories than usual. And by the time he gets to the words, he practically mumbles them. You can hear him on YouTube. And that's because Ronald Reagan's most strong psychological drive was his sense of his own innocence, that he was not a venal person, that he was not a demagogue. And his ability to project that sense of his own innocence was absolutely crucial to why he did such a good job of reassuring Americans that policies that, if propounded by other politicians, like Barry Goldwater in 1964, would sound reactionary, nasty, selfish, bigoted. So he gave the speech, and the Carter campaign and Democrats around the country immediately pounced, right? And it was so effective in basically exactly reversing the intention, the entire strategy of the Reagan campaign, in pigeonholing Reagan as someone who was in sympathy with African American, with bigots. That one of his campaign workers in Mississippi wrote an angry letter to the campaign saying, "We had Mississippi in the bag, and now it's a toss-up." And to this day, the Neshoba County speech is remembered as proof positive that Ronald Reagan stoked the fires of bigotry in order to win the election. Now, the thing that really connects it up to your work is that the official code of the gatekeeping media elites when it comes to electioneering is this fiction that somehow America is united and at peace with itself. And Reagan fell afoul of those kind of gatekeepers, those referees who were writing editorials about Reagan's divisiveness, precisely because he had stepped over some invisible boundary that reminded people that these conflicts existed when you were supposed to pretend that they didn't exist at all.
Right. That these old conflicts had been sort of transformed into the language. You know,
we are now a colorblind nation, right?
Right. Supposedly innocuous language, and any callback that's too obvious, which is, you know, again, the trouble that Trump got into in Charlottesville. Right. Was, you know, what do they say online? Saying the quiet part out loud.
Right.
You know?
Trump says the quiet part out loud. The biggest difference between Ronald Reagan's appeal to a conservative electorate and Donald Trump's is that Ronald Reagan was, in fact, the master of the dog whistle. Now, Donald Trump is the train whistle. Now, you ask, does he, in fact, hold a conception of the Constitution that rhymes with the Southern doctrine of states' rights? The answer is absolutely, right? He opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act on the same grounds that Barry Goldwater did, that it was not the business of the federal government to tell businesses what they could and could not do. He opposed a open housing referendum by saying that people had the right to dispose of their property as they wished. He criticized the 1965 Voting Rights Act, saying that it singled out the South and that it was unfair. And his whole constitutional doctrine, his whole idea of the role of the federal government was that it should be as small as possible, right? So he definitely believed that states should usurp powers that had previously been held by the federal government. But a big part of his success as a politician was an ability to present this in a way that had shaved off any racial reference. And that was why he was successful, and that's why it was so dangerous for him to kind of signal, you know, this sort of racial entailment in his Neshoba County speech. Now, the fascinating question is, considering the fact that as president, he did things like, you know, cut the budget for public housing by 80%, does that make him less of a contributor to America's racial ordeal, or more of a contributor to America's racial ordeal? Was his ability to persuade white voters who were voting for him in some sense because he was taking the federal government out of the business of uplifting African Americans? And we know from the exit poll results that people who believed that the federal government was doing too much for blacks voted for Reagan overwhelmingly over Jimmy Carter. Was this a reactionary thing, right? And I think the answer is yes, right? I mean, he kept sort of like racial policy making going when it had been on fumes, precisely because he absolved America of the taint of racism and let people vote for him in a way that made life worse for African Americans while believing they weren't doing so.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, as you know from the book, throughout American history, American politicians find success by subsuming racism into the rhetoric of national unity, and that that was the basis on which white supremacy ruled this country, up to 1861 and then after 1865.
The Christian white supremacy was to threaten the unity of the nation.
Right.
Right. So I have a question for you.
Shoot.
One of the fun things about writing history is that you get to weaponize hindsight in order to dramatize how things that now seem inevitable almost didn't happen. It's especially powerful in your book because the irony turns around the formation of the United States itself. You have a picture of a continental $3 bill with the Latin motto, "The outcome is in doubt." What are some of the reasons the outcome was in doubt, that the United States almost did not become the United States?
Thank you for the question. To me, this goes to why did it take so long for a union to be formed in the first place? We kind of skip over the colonial era pretty quickly, but it was 150 years, the same time from today back to the Civil War, where the colonies existed without a union. And they every time, it wasn't because they didn't have the idea, nobody had suggested it, people had, like Benjamin Franklin, but they rejected it out of hand. They wanted nothing to do with one another. They didn't want to form a union. And when the revolution came, they formed one as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. Nobody really wanted to join together. They only did so because it seemed like that was the only way to beat Britain, to rebel against the crown and defeat what some of them at least considered tyranny. So that reluctance, I suggest, played a role in the fragility of this coalition once it was formed, and it was fragile from the start. Why did it almost break apart or not even survive through the Civil War? The Declaration of Independence did not create a union. It was really a disunion document. It was a secessionist manifesto that got the colonies out of their relationship with Great Britain. It dissolved the bands that united one people with another, but it didn't form a new nation. It wasn't a constitutional document. To create that, they needed to work on one and draw it up, and that was ultimately the Articles of Confederation. But in the summer of 1776, they actually couldn't come to terms of union. They couldn't find any agreeable document that they could all sign, and it took absolutely forever, right up to the end of the war. And there were a few issues and divisions that really divided the American people at the very beginning. One was Western lands. Who would control this vast land mass, on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, that the Americans expected they would come into?
What were the battle lines for that? Who was pro and who was con?
Well, if you were a large state like Virginia, which had a colony dating back to the early 17th century, that said that Virginia had the land. A colony. Well, it was a colony of Great Britain.
Okay, I see. Right.
And they had a charter that said they had all the land from sea to sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, wherever that was. Nobody knew how big that was. But if you were a colony like Maryland, you didn't have that in your charter, and you had no lands at all. That was called a landless state. So Virginia wanted to control the land that it thought was its right, whereas Maryland wanted all the new land to go into the national domain, wanted Congress to control it, and ultimately break it apart into new states that would join the Union on equal terms as its members, as its original 13 members. So this is why Maryland was the last holdout state that refused to ratify the Articles of Confederation right up until almost the end of the war. And I tell this story in this book, this very little known story about why Maryland finally did ratify the Articles of Confederation, and that was because they were being blackmailed by a foreign power. We think that foreign meddling, by Russia and Trump and whatnot, is kind of a new thing, but it really isn't. It was all over the new republic in the 1770s all the way up to the early 19th century. Maryland was facing a British invasion in 1781, and requested France, which was America's great patron during the war, to send ships and men to protect them. And the French ambassador to the United States took this opportunity to kind of give Maryland an offer that they couldn't refuse, and said, well, maybe we'll see about sending the ship. It'd be great if you could ratify the Articles of Confederation, because we're totally tired of dealing with 13 separate states, 2,000 miles apart. So there wouldn't have been a union without foreign meddling.
So we have independence before there was a nation.
Yeah, well, that's the Confederate theory, and that's precisely what Lincoln was arguing against. Yeah. He said that there was a union before there was independence, and this was kind of an academic dispute at the time. But a lot really, relied on that. Another story, from about that period, shows that even if there was a union before the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln's theory was that it was formed by this trade boycott that the Continental Congress devised in 1774. Lincoln was dealing with the secessionist movement in South Carolina during the debates in the Continental Congress in 1774 over that trade boycott. South Carolina walked out of the Congress to protest a provision that they didn't like. And they only agreed to join once that provision was taken out. So even if there was a union before independence, it was, compromised from the very beginning by the very same kind of separatist tendencies that Lincoln was dealing with in his time. So that's the Western lands are one issue. Another issue was representation, which we know a lot about today. Would the people be represented in the Congress, or would the states? Would the states have equal voting power as they do today in the Senate, or would the people be represented overall, by proportion of population in the Congress? And that was a massive, massive debate in the Revolutionary period, and later on.
Hit me.
All right.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Well, my interest in the Constitution and in American institutions. So this one's about the presidency. All your books are about either presidents or presidential candidates.
Only because presidents sell.
Of course, yeah. There are obviously these massive canvases of social and cultural history, but they're pegged to the president.
President on the cover, and you have a chance of getting on the bestseller list. That's what
right. And you get interviews with Walter Isaacson, as you did recently. But it is a story of the American presidency. LBJ abdicates office in March of 1968. Nixon, we know what Nixon did. Nixon resigned. Ford pardoned Nixon and discredited the presidency, was totally defeated in the 76 election. And then Carter comes along and is an atrocious world historical failure. And even the best that Democrats can say is, when he's running for re-election, 1980 is,
Yeah, Joe Biden endorses him and says what does he say? I know he's not wheat cakes, but he's doing the best he can. That's
right. Well, the Biden
providing his it was kind of preserving his viability for 1980.
Yeah. Well, I a lot of the reviewers of your book have talked about Trump's very brief appearance, but I think the Biden appearances are even more interesting. Anyway, my question is about the presidency. It seemed by 1979, 1980 that the president, could anybody fill this office of the presidency? Was it a failed institution? And it struck me while reading your book that for all his faults, and there are many, Reagan might have saved the American presidency because he actually did have the charisma and the ability to do the job. Do you see it that way? Can you imagine?
That's a really interesting question, and I have a very specific answer. That it was very clear almost from the beginning, but became sort of almost doctrine, and I think accurate doctrine, by the time James Fallows wrote this famous cover article in the Atlantic Monthly, just as Carter's presidency is falling apart, called The Passionless Presidency. Fallows had been a speechwriter for Carter. Although almost at the same time, a little before this, Nicholas Lemon, a really young journalist then, writes a similar article in Texas Monthly, and they basically talk about how Jimmy Carter is such a micromanager, and then he's trying to kind of keep his finger in all the roles of the executive branch. And that's the reason, one of the major reasons for his failure as a president. And, two great examples. One is that he, in between his election and his inauguration, he reads the entire report of the Army Corps of Engineers and decides 50 water projects are basically not paying off for the American people, so he's going to unilaterally cancel them. And when he does that, he almost causes a full revolt by the entire Democratic caucus of the Congress of the United States, because, of course, these guys rely on their water projects for patronage and votes.
Even more absurdly, there's the moment where he kind of resents the idea that he's allowed 150 new federal judicial appointments.
Right. That's his
burden
for power, but that's not really related to this part of it. This part of it is his micromanaging, right? So the other examples, one of his big campaign promises is that he's going to reform the tax code, which he says is a disgrace to the human race. And he doesn't really explain what that means, lower taxes, raise taxes. But to do it, he reads the entire 2,000-page tax code, right? And comes up with basically a rejiggering of the tax code without any concept of the fact that all these, Christmas tree ornaments on this massive thing all have these kind of political backstories and path dependencies, right? So he can't manage the White House because he's trying to manage the White House. And one of the interesting things that happens when Ronald Reagan is running for the presidency is the same thing that always happens when Ronald Reagan runs for office, including for governor, which is that all the commentators say, how can this guy run a government? He's so incurious. He's so poorly informed. He barely knows what his own policies are for. And there was a terror when Ronald Reagan became president that the country would fall apart or that we'd nuke the whole world. And one of the remarkable things that happens is that, as every Reagan biographer, hagiographic or critical, puts at the center of the story of the Reagan presidency, he was completely out of touch. Even Dinesh D'Souza, in his worshipful book about Reagan as the greatest president ever, says he was great because he just let everyone else do everything and just kind of decided, what the themes of the president were going to be, what the narratives of the presidency were going to be. And it turns out that that's a pretty good way to be president. Mm-hmm. That, with the complexity of the federal government, with all the different political cross pressures at play, that a president who tries to have a finger in every pie and run everything and monitor everything basically goes crazy, right?
Well, it's especially a good strategy if you're on your way to having dementia,
Well, so it's not because Ronald Reagan is any genius and he has some kind of sophisticated, theory of executive power, but he's not curious. Everything he's learned, decades ago, and he's not going to learn anything new. Famously at a reception, he said to his own Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, by the way, this relates to your first question, who happened to be African American, nice to see you, Mr. Mayor. Right? So he didn't even know who his own officials were. Mm-hmm. It turns out that delegating everything to the grown-ups in the room, and this is where kind of Donald Trump, is very much a different kind of figure, like the James Bakers, like the Howard Bakers, like the Ed Meeses, like the Alexander Haigs, the day-to-day operations of the presidency, in which he basically followed a script written by other people, worked much more smoothly than the Carter administration. So I don't think he saved the presidency because of his, great charisma or anything. But just to give a parallel, I remember that when I was growing up and New York was kind of going to shit, and there was always garbage in the streets and the crime rates were astronomical, my dad, who's this Midwestern small businessman, would say New York City is ungovernable. And now I know that was kind of a cliche. That's what everyone said. And, for various reasons, it seemed to become more ungovernable. More governable. A lot of that was because this guy Giuliani came around and started bashing heads, and white people were like, oh yeah, turns out the city is governable after all. Mm-hmm. But this idea that the country had become ungovernable pretty much kind of fades, during the Reagan years, and seems to be an epiphenomenon of this very strange presidential managerial style of Jimmy Carter.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's spin the wheel.
Let's head west, young man. So really, one of the really fun things about your book is the Western expansion stuff. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that really, I love history books. Like, I never enjoyed the books I read about slavery when I was in college and the plantation system, because I could never figure out, how did these guys communicate with each other, right? I couldn't get a sense of the everydayness of life below the Mason-Dixon line before, the 1860s, right? And one of the pleasures about your book is I really kind of feel like, what was it like to try and be a political figure during the 18th century, during the 19th century, how great the distances were, how hard communication was. And one of the fun things that happens with this is the sheer alienation between these parts of the country that could only communicate with each other with a lag time of, you know, days or weeks or months.
Right.
And one of the ways that kind of plays out is as these various chunks of the landmass between the Atlantic and the Pacific become, you know, part of, basically as I'm not even going to say America gets control of them, but as other countries lose control of them, again and again and again, these various chunks of America that we now think of as American, you know, we can't even conceive them not being part of America, either consider joining other countries or becoming their own countries, right? So kind of off the top of your head, give me some good examples of some of these chunks out there that are kind of deciding whether these people 3,000 miles away should have anything to do with them.
Yeah, well, you know, my favorite one is California and the West Coast. A lot of people were talking about Calexit, California secession, after the 2016 election. But there wasn't much awareness that this is an extremely old concept. Even Thomas Jefferson, though he didn't really know much about California, he knew that the fur trader John Jacob Astor had established a settlement in what we now call Oregon in the 1810s. And he said, Mr. Astor, I wish you well, but that'll probably be a separate empire from ours. And, you know, it's too far away. We'll probably have nothing to do with it. And that was an extremely popular position. You know, another person, Daniel Webster, who we associate with national unity, you know, liberty and union, one and inseparable, actually didn't really think that when it came to the West Coast. He thought that as long as it was settled by, you know, white Anglo-Saxon men, you know, from America, it would be fine. It didn't need to be part of the Union. The West Coast could establish its own separate republic. And this was an extremely popular idea at a time where there was no transcontinental railroad. There was no Panama Canal. It took months to get from, say, New York to San Francisco, you know, during the gold rush. And
it's like having a state on the moon.
Absolutely. It totally was. It was a totally different world. And it was populated, especially after the gold rush, by people from all over the place, all over the world, people from China especially, but South America and Europe and everywhere, everywhere, that had no attachment to the United States and no real desire to be part of it at all. And I suggest actually that, you know, the desire for a transcontinental railroad was kind of a threat that Californians issued to the United States, that if you don't build this, we're going to secede and form our own union. So it's actually during the Civil War that Lincoln decides to start building the transcontinental railroad as a way to prevent the Union from breaking along an east-west boundary as it already had north-south.
But by that time, there's a reason to want California. They have all that gold.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Well, that's also a reason for California to want to be independent, because they would be a totally self-sufficient nation, as many people think that today it would be as well.
It's so interesting. I'm sorry. Continue. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, so one of the interesting things about how I was kind of almost like laughed aloud when I realized how easy it was to kind of form a kind of nation during this period. Like, you have this guy, James Wilkinson. I love his story. But basically, you can tell how this kind of plays out. But, you know, all you really need is a gunboat and a port. And, you know, there's very little, states were very small then, right? Certainly the American state was very small. There was very little taxation. So as long as you could kind of collect a tariff at the port, you know, you could say you had a nation, right? Yeah,
well, if the port is New Orleans and it's at the bottom of the Mississippi River Valley, then you control everything along every waterway that empties into the Mississippi. And, you know, you almost immediately have an empire. And that was Aaron Burr's whole plan.
So you had these kind of rogues and entrepreneurs, and this guy Wilkinson is one of the most colorful, I think.
Yeah, well, he stretches across like several chapters in different decades, because he was willing to take money from anybody, and to, you know, his allegiance really meant nothing. And, you know, during the Constitutional Convention, he was actually bargaining with Spain, which was in control of New Orleans at the time, where they were going to subsidize him to stir up separatism in Kentucky. And this was, you know, and he was on the payroll with Spain for 20 years. And everybody kind of knew it. He was in charge of the United States Army for a long time. And everybody knew this guy was a total traitor. You know, I was actually writing that piece of the book the day that Paul Manafort was arrested. And there was all this news about these, you know, traitors high up in the U.S. government and in the presidential campaign in the pay of foreign powers. And it really felt to me like we were back at the early days of the Republic, that we've kind of seen our heyday And we were now back to this position of total impotence and disunity that was, not really created by foreign powers, but that they were in a position to take advantage of. I suspect we're only going to see
in this
more
liminal state where kind of con men and grifters sort of find their. In the history of Chicago is completely like that. It's like, it's like basically there's a settlement and it has this great location, and everyone knows that eventually there's going to be a canal built here. So all these kind of people come and basically start ripping each other off, and basically forming these mini fiefdoms, waiting for the canal to come. And the canal really never comes. Then eventually the railroad comes. But by that time, so the political character and culture of Chicago is completely, sort of formed by these James Wilkinson's, Paul Manafort-like characters, and it still has that kind of reputation today.
Yeah, well, we actually haven't talked about this before, but the Chicago figures in the book during the Civil War, where there was a conspiracy to establish a Midwestern Republic.
Huzzah! I'm ready. Maybe people would realize that Chicago was in a different time zone then when they invite me to do radio shows.
Yeah. So I'll ask you another one.
Can I be?
This one is about sectional tensions during your period. This book, and also just overall. I've got this great quote from Goldwater that I love, which I must have found in your book, which is that Goldwater once said that he wished that the East Coast could be sawed off and just float out to sea. Right. And LBJ made a great, presidential campaign commercial about that in 1964. And then in Reagan land in the late 70s, the Southwest is basically cursing the Northeast for using too much oil. And they say, let them freeze in the dark. And, people, this is kind of a return of my theme in an era that I think most people don't really realize it was there. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about geographical tensions in the 60s and 70s and how much you weight that compared to, say, generational gaps or religious differences.
Totally. So, it's really interesting. I could definitely kind of reread some of my sources in light of that insight. There was a guy, I don't know if he's still around, he's a wonderful British journalist and also a historian named Godfrey Hodgson. He wrote the best book about the 1968 election that came out basically the year after, and he wrote a wonderful book that you should read called American, what is it called? He wrote a great book about basically the history of the post-war American consensus. But I corresponded with him when I was starting my Goldwater book because he'd written some stuff about the conservative movement. And he talked about his first trip to Arizona. And this would have been, the early 1960s, when Goldwater was kind of becoming a national figure, and he was writing about it. And he said, these elites, these people around Goldwater who basically were like, like plantation potentates in a lot of ways, talked about the East like they were being colonized. Like they talked about Wall Street like it was a colonial power, and they were suing for their independence. And in fact, in Making the President in 1964, Theodore White points out that New York, Wall Street, controlled 50% of the nation's banking reserves. So basically, financially, the rest of the nation, especially the nation west of the Mississippi, really was almost like a colony of Wall Street. And that's why the greatest term of derision for kind of the isolationist Midwestern Republicans and also then the Southwestern Republicans was Wall Street Republicans, right? That like these sort of small businessmen who formed the political and cultural and social and economic base of the right wing of the Republican Party, and Goldwater basically came to Wall Street hat in hand for their very survival. And a lot of the guys who were the people who were involved in the original draft Goldwater movement, the people who were involved in getting Conscience of a Conservative, Barry Goldwater's book published, looking at their correspondence and the papers of one of their leaders, this guy Clarence Mannion, who was a dean at Notre Dame, they would be foundry owners in Milwaukee, or they had a lumber company in Tennessee, or a toiletry fixture company in Minnesota. Their stationery would have an address in their town and then also an address in New York, because they literally had to have branches in order to basically beg for capital from a company like Morgan Stanley, which if you read Nick Lemon's wonderful book Transaction Man, it was almost like a feudal organization. It was literally 25 partners who decided who got money. And the way things were set up were it was such a monopoly for finance capital that there was no negotiation. They just decided what your interest rate was going to be. They decided how much stock they were going to issue. They decided how much you were going to charge, who would sell it around the country. So that's very much a part of the Goldwater movement. And then, of course, I can just say the sentence and just say the resentments between the South, and the North, speak to that profoundly. And that the guy at the Goldwater Convention, after he was nominated in 1964 from the South, who said, we just pushed the Mason-Dixon line clear up to Canada, that was a statement of the regional civil war, right? Yeah. Then the thing you're talking about in the 1970s is, as America's energy stores are going to shit in 1979 after Iran embargoes their energy after the hostage crisis, the first thing to understand about why this was so traumatic for the country is America, not only had there never been, an energy problem, but energy wasn't even conceptualized as a thing that could be scarce. During the Nixon administration, there was a Nixon official who told the president that within 10 years, energy is going to be so plentiful that it's going to be too cheap to meter, right? Mm-hmm. So it just was not an economic factor. It's like energy prices were stable. They were way below even inflation, for decades, right? And then suddenly the third world decides they're going to throw their weight around. And then once there's an energy shortage, and Jimmy Carter decides he's going to create a national energy policy, it's exactly like a chapter out of your book. How can there be a national energy policy when some states are energy producers and their interests are completely centered around high prices, just like farmers need high prices, and lack of regulation, and basically they need infrastructure to get their stuff to market. And then there's energy consuming places like New England. And during the winters of 77, 78, and especially 1979, there's home heating oil shortages. And, the children, I depict a child in the Bronx freezing to death, right? So the prices are going way up. So they want price controls, right? And there's this enormous regional resentment symbolized by this bumper sticker that was very popular in Texas that I think you mentioned, let them freeze in the dark. Yeah. And then yeah.
Sorry, during the gas shortage in California, when Californians are, it's an apocalyptic scenario. You mentioned that people in the rest of the country didn't see it as their problem at all.
Yeah, it's like there's a senator from Illinois, Charlie Percy, who says, well, this is what California gets from being selfish and building their whole civilization around the automobile. Of course, that derision lasts for exactly a month until it spreads to the rest of the country. Right. Yeah, and it's a lot like something like the European Union, where rich countries and poor countries that have completely different fiscal interests are trying to, form one unit. The same thing happens when Jimmy Carter attends a G7 summit around oil, and some countries are energy independent. Some countries have 200% gas taxes and thinks it's crazy that America has their gas so cheap. So the idea of having some kind of common front against OPEC is just, it can't happen. But it can't happen in the United States either. So that's another reason why Jimmy Carter's hubris and believing that he can kind of be an engineer and kind of outside of politics can kind of create this sort of jerry-rigged Rube Goldberg energy structure that's going to kind of completely recombine all the ways energy is produced and distributed throughout the United States. It's a complete pipe dream.
Yeah. Because, should we switch to questions? I see I'm being asked to draw the lines for a dissolved United States.
I think I pretty much exhausted the themes I was interested in.
I feel like we could talk for another 10 hours, but I don't think C-SPAN's going to cover it.
This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as you know. So I'm asking the questions, right?
I think you're getting them from the box there, yeah.
Right, I'm getting the box, and I'm going to articulate the questions. From Thomas on Facebook. I almost feel like we always get, you and me probably get so many questions about Trump, and we probably get a little bit, oh, this is interesting. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's go global. Thomas wants to know, Richard, what you think of the independence movements in Europe, like Scotland and Catalonia, and to a lesser extent, the Ukraine, and how they mesh with history you tell, and maybe even kind of like America's sense of exceptionalism, that somehow we don't have this kind of stuff. It's a European thing. It's an Asian thing.
Yeah, but I talk in the book about how, if we're exceptional in any way, I think it's for our fragility. We talk about countries like Sudan or Syria that were kind of cobbled together after World War One, by former imperial masters. Right. These peoples who really wanted nothing to do with each other and hadn't historically.
Colonialists drawing lines on a map.
Exactly, but that's precisely what the United States is. Right. They didn't want anything to do with each other, and they were only combined together, in these ways. And that's forgetting about the question of indigenous nations. I don't feel prepared to comment or to decide the benefits of these different secessionist movements. I've been interested by Scotland's one in particular, because in America we associate secessionism with Confederacy, racism, but and basically localism. But in Scotland, especially after the 2016 Brexit referendum, they want to secede from Great Britain so as to be part of the European Union. Right. So this is a cosmopolitan secessionism of a kind that I think, if I were to support any kind of separatism in the United States today or in the future, it would be of that kind of
Right. And I also heard it described as basically Scotland is striking for to preserve and extend social democracy, things like free college and stuff like that. So here's a question.
Some people see Catalonia that way too.
One of mine actually. So you get into the present, and to me that part of the book, when you start talking about Calexit and Texit and all that stuff, is a little less convincing to me, because one of the things that seems so salient about the fragility of those boundaries and those lines and the union and disunion in the 19th century was precisely because states were just so much less kind of large, complicated. Their economic ties were not as profound, and frankly, one of the stories I tell in my book, and why there was a tax revolt, was because most people in America just barely paid any income taxes until the 1950s, the 1960s. So I guess that's my way of setting up my friend Howard Park's question, which is, do you think secession might ever happen in large states such as Texas or California?
I do think it's possible. I found that section of my book convincing. I'm kidding.
Good.
Tack it on. I mean, these movements are fringe in their states right now. But I wrote the book because I was seeing growing signs that this might become an actual thing. And honestly, the last 4 years that I've been working on it, especially since Trump's election, have only convinced me further of that. If not a day goes by that I don't read the newspaper and find something that tells me that we're breaking apart, or scan Twitter, at 3 a.m. and find somebody saying, if Trump is reelected, we should secede from the United States. My aunt, who must be watching this, who lives in California, thought that I was a maniac when I came up with this idea in 2014, 2015. Yeah. That's the craziest idea of all. And she thinks about it pretty seriously now. And I think a lot of people in California do. Should the election this November devolve into gridlock and violence, as I relate in the book, other elections in American history have in 1800 and 1876, I think it's very likely you're going to see, more people talking about secession. Does that mean it's going to happen in 2020? I'm not so sure. But as climate change continues to, ravage this continent, and the federal government, as it was with coronavirus this year, is totally absent and effectively abdicates responsibility, I think you're going to be seeing perhaps more secessionist movements, but also more regional associations form, as they did in the spring, when 3 groups of 17 governors on the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast formed these pacts among themselves to coordinate the purchase of protective equipment and lockdown policies. In a pinch, which there's going to be more of, I think that we're going to see recourse to that solution more and more, and that could, harden into more formal arrangements that essentially replace the present Constitution.
I guess you just have a more capacious historical imagination than I do. First of all, I
I'm
love that
just
all the
more
questions,
pessimistic.
yeah, maybe. I love that all the questions are for Ricky because I'm tired of answering questions, and I think you deserve more attention. So there's a really good question from Hamilton Kane, a really smart guy. So what about? I'm going to skip Sean Wilentz. I'm going to ask question, part of his question about.
Did Sean Wilentz ask a question?
No, he didn't ask a question. Someone asked him. I'm just going to David Hackett Fisher, right? So he's a writer who wrote a book called Albion Seed, in which he separates various folkways that basically the American nation is kind of organically divided into. So what do you think of his theory? And maybe the broader question is, how big a role does kind of culture and folkways play in these sort of regional divisions in history and now?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, I find Fisher convincing. It's kind of an older book now, about the 17th century and about really early American history, where it's a story of these different migrations from England and from different parts of England and how they shaped different settlements in the future United States, right up to the Revolution and beyond. I'm not sure that holds any, our people didn't come from England. I'm not sure we've integrated into, the folkways of the Midlands in the 16th century or something. And the theory was modernized by a guy named Colin Woodard in a book called American Nations about 10 or 12 years ago, where he divides the United States up into 11 regional cultures. I have my problems with that theory as well. I think we're more of a city-country division at this point than regions. I'm in the Catskills right now. There's a lot of people around here who think pretty differently from my neighbors in Brooklyn.
Any Confederate flags?
Not here, but you mentioned the Goldwater quote about pushing the Mason-Dixon up to the north. My wife and I were traveling around Greece once, and we were driving from Athens to Delphi, and we saw a Confederate flag on the side of the road.
Athens, Georgia? Okay.
No, not Athens. I was astonished.
This is a good question. Maybe not as related to necessarily the themes of your book necessarily closely, although maybe they do. But it really is related to the fact that you've read deeply in sources and secondary sources on the founding. And this is a question I would definitely want to know and have my own opinions on. I'll just read it verbatim. A current area of my interest is dispelling the myth that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation. How big a role did religious belief or lack thereof delay the formation of the Union, and what might be the future impact?
That's a really good question. Religion doesn't play as much of a role in my book as I would like, and that's regrettable because it's a religious concept, of spiritual union and communal union. So how much did religious differences delay the formation of a union? I don't think much at all. I didn't end up getting into the book. But anti-Catholic feeling played a major role in motivating several people, especially in New England, to join the rebellion against the crown. Because in 1774, the British Parliament passed something called the Quebec Act, which was a way to consolidate the British victory in the 7 Years' War, and it effectively granted religious liberty to French Catholics who were living in Canada at the time, and extended the size of Quebec into the backcountry, thus angering surveyors and speculators like George Washington, who saw this act as threatening to their land deals. But anti-Catholic prejudice essentially played a really big role in motivating many people to back the revolution. I hope that's an answer.
That definitely was present in our New York Review of Books article in the 1740 case of people being terrified that there was a naval conspiracy to get the slaves to be united with the Indians and burn down all of New York. Well, this is Chris has a better way of kind of asking my question. And it's the one about how it just doesn't seem to be, secession doesn't seem to be feasible to me because states are, the nation state is so much more powerful and does so much more. Richard, would you agree that secession is not economically feasible? I guess you don't today, and wouldn't occur because of the large impact the federal government has on a state's economy?
That's a really good question. I think, I'm not sure I would go so far as to say it's not economically feasible, but it would certainly render it extremely difficult and disruptive for sure. That's why the book is not really a program that addresses all of these possible concerns. It's a history of the concept. But there, in the spring, Mitch McConnell derided Democratic governors for requesting so-called blue state bailouts, financial assistance to help them recover from the coronavirus. and to deal with the fallout and whatnot. And a lot of people pointed out that that's not at all how our government or our country works. It's the opposite, that the blue states very much subsidize the red states. So there have been proposals. Kevin Baker in the New Republic, after Trump's election, with his article for Bluexit, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it, but Blue Exit, democratic states should withhold federal revenue until the government is doing what we want. And so there's, there would certainly be economic complications and problems, but California, New York, these states send a lot more money to the federal government than they get back in return. So it would certainly be disruptive. I would like to see a lot more study of this very question and to see whether it would be economically feasible. I think it might have to be in the future. We might have to find a way to make it so.
Right. Meaning the people who believe in climate change and science.
Yeah, I don't even define the we anymore. It's so obvious.
Oh, that's
we non-fascists.
Yeah. So this is a question that I think we both can answer, but I'll give it to you first. Racism, Wall Street, it feels like our divisions are really stuck and keep reemerging. Have any of them been resolved? Do we have a historical precedent, and I guess this would be anywhere, of moving past conflict?
It's a really good question. I think immediately of the religion question that we were just talking about, and this is kind of more of a world historical phenomenon. But Protestants and Catholics are not accusing one another of witchcraft or devilry or conspiracies anymore. They actually.
We're the ones who are doing witchcraft and devilry and conspiracy.
The Jews. Yeah. And as you show in your book, actually, the story of the late 70s is conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants joining up in a political coalition and setting their differences aside. So I guess that would be one example. Otherwise, I think that differences, we were talking about California earlier in the 1840s and 1850s, and these were divisions and tensions that were caused by lack of communication, far distances. And that's why people have always favored, major infrastructure projects in the United States, from, the Erie Canal to the New Deal projects to the Green New Deal today. These are ways to kind of physically tie the country together and de-emphasize regional differences. And in my sappier moments, I kind of think that all we really need to do is travel around the country more and reacquaint ourselves with one another more, and that maybe that would do it.
Wow. That's so like Walter Isaacson, man.
So lame. I know, but I love traveling around the country, and I don't want to not be able to.
Well, you can get a visa,
Right.
So my answer to that question. So I think a lot about how America handles division and doesn't handle division, and I think of it in kind of psychoanalytic terms, that when you repress conflict, it just kind of comes back in a worse, uglier form. Freud called it the return of the repressed, and that one of the reasons America is such a bitter, angry, kind of dysfunctional country is that, and this is a big theme of kind of subterranean theme in my last book, Invisible Bridge, is that when movements come about in which people begin, institutions begin, movements begin, beginning a real serious conversation, reckoning with the divisions and challenges and flaws and injustices of our country, then the Reaganite card gets played, which is that basically you're just being divisive. You think you're apologizing for America, that you're kind of you're creating conflicts instead of addressing conflicts. And to me, what was really exciting about the period right after Watergate and during Vietnam and during the first energy crisis was that I thought there was this kind of left-wing patriotism discourse that was developing in the country, in which people were talking about what would it feel like? What would it mean if America was not the world's policeman? What would it mean if we had sort of foreign policies that were based more on international cooperation than neo-colonial domination? What would it mean to really address our racial ordeal as we see people dealing with now, and as we see that being completely pushed back by the Republicans, who basically call that act of reckoning itself almost like an act of violence, right? And to me, the countries that have really done the profound work of transcending conflict in a bone deep and history transforming way are the ones that have gone deepest in the process of acknowledging that conflict. And that's the kind of the model here is South African Truth and Reconciliation, in which basically, you offer people basically a blanket pardon in exchange for acknowledging and repenting for their past, right? Well, acknowledging and repenting for our past is not something that, I'll just put it bluntly, Red America wants to do, right? So how can we possibly have some kind of unity between the various sort of structural abrasions, within our national body if we're not even sort of doing the surgery, right? So I think another example, not quite two places that are divided, but another example of that sort of mature historical process going on would be, Germany's reckoning with, its past and the Holocaust. Incomplete, imperfect, but still happening, and still real. I almost think like I've been doing a lot of reading about sort of social democracy, and one of the ways, like these Northern European countries that have these strong social democracies, it didn't happen because people that sat down at a bargaining table and looked each other in the eye and struck deals. It happened through blood and conflict. Finland had like massacres and just massive death, and they had a civil war in which basically the elites of the country were massacring farmers and workers, right? And they were just like, no, we have to find a better way. It's not like these countries, there's this myth that like these Northern European, Scandinavian countries can basically share so well because they're so so homogeneous. But the history belies that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it can be done, but it requires a spiritual depth that sort of American citizenship is kind of lost if you consider kind of the nation as a whole. All right, we're kind of getting to the end. Do you want to like maybe just say some last profound words about maybe what do you have coming next? You've written your first book. It's amazing. It's been the project of a lifetime. What's your second album?
Oh, I'm not really sure. I don't want to answer that one. I'm going to go back to what you were talking about, and maybe the profound words will come. I saw a sign at one of the protests in the spring, the George Floyd protest, that said, we're trying to make this country something it has never been. And that really struck me because I think that is the case. That is what we're trying to do. The problem is as you well know, and as you've documented,
even our country, as James Baldwin said.
Right, but the problem is that's how the other side sees it too. They also think that we're trying to make the country something it's never been, and they just don't want any part of that.
Right.
And I don't see how we get over that. I really don't see how we get over those divisions. And if we want to make a country different than this one has ever been, we might need to start a new one. That's my supposition.
Yeah. Here's my last word, actually, and it has to do with this kind of dreamed of book that I'm going to write 10 or 20 years ago, about 20 years from now, about how America, the denial of conflict, this kind of structured, organized denial of conflict, is the big hidden variable that makes America what America is, and why America cannot get its shit together. So we're on a software platform to broadcast this called Crowdcast. And in the ask a question box, the kind of prompt with a smiley face says, say something nice. Okay.
What?
Say something nice. That is the reason America cannot be other than it is, because you are kind of culturally required to say something nice. You're not allowed to kind of bring to the fore the nastiness, the ugliness, the kind of hard words it takes to sound out and create the reverberations of tension that it requires to resolve tension. So America will not become great again until we drop the imperative to say something nice.
Yeah, take that, Crowdcast.
Selah. All right, so we're going to sign off.
Buy Rick. Thanks a lot, Rick.
If you only have $26 to spend on a book, buy his. I'm doing okay.
Buy his.
See you all later.